Hello, this is the chapter on unemployment. Basically, in economics, when you define someone as unemployed, they must have one of three characteristics. They must be within the working age. So, for instance, an infant cannot be unemployed, and nor can a pensioner be unemployed. So they must be within the working age range, which is usually 16 to 65. They must be available for work. In other words, if they were offered a job, they must be able to take up that job if they want. And they must be looking for work. That means they must have looked for a job, I think it's within the last 4 weeks. So that's what defines someone as unemployed in economics. So the opposite of those are those people who work. So when we take the workers, the employed, and we add them to the people who are unemployed, they're not employed, but they're looking for a job. They're available for a job and they're within that working age range, and they're not incarcerated. They're not in a mental institution, and they're not, those people are unable to take a job if it was offered to them for the most part. When you add those two together, the employed and the unemployed, you get what we call the labor force. So it's those people who are in work or who potentially could be in work, really. You can think of it like that. So that's what this first slide is all about. Apart from the last part, that is the people who are not in the labor force. They're neither employed nor are they unemployed. What kind of people are those? People who, for instance, are homemakers who are not looking for a job. They already have a full-time job looking after the kids at home. Also people who maybe are independently wealthy. They're rich and they don't particularly want to work. They can live off their investment income, for instance. Those people who work in the black market, and many of them are working in illegal markets, and as such they are invisible as far as the economy is concerned. Looking at the size of the economy, and therefore they're not looking for an official job. Okay, so those are the categorizations. So here is a breakdown in terms of the population in 2009. You can see that there were 81.7 million people who were not in the labor force. On the other hand, the people in the labor force, you can see the bracket there on the right of this bar chart, are the employed and those who are unemployed. So we have to distinguish here, and this bar chart nicely does it, between the adult population, that includes people who aren't in the labor force, and the labor force. So that is the difference. And you can see that the adult population is always going to be bigger than the labor force for that reason. Now, some of you might be thinking about military personnel. They are taken out of all of these statistics. So when you hear people talking about the labor force, they often use the terminology civilian labor force. So military are not classified, I don't think, as being in the adult population or being in the labor force. I wish that stupid thing would stop popping up. How irritating. Anyway, off we go. So here, this just reiterates what I've already said. The labor force is basically the total of employed plus the total of unemployed workers. Now, once we've got that, what we can do is think of the unemployed people as a percentage of the labor force. And we call that the unemployment rate. And the equation to calculate that is at the bottom of this slide. So you take the number of unemployed, you divide by the total number of people in the labor force, get that as a fraction, and then multiply it up by 100 to get a percentage. And that's what the unemployment rate that you hear quoted on the TV is. So at the moment in the US, the unemployment rate is 9.1%. That means that 9.1% of the labor force does not have a job, but is available for work and is looking for work. Now, there's a few things I want to talk about as we go on here, but the one thing to note, first of all, is part-time workers. Where are they? Are they in the labor force? The answer is yes. Are they employed or unemployed though? Because they're kind of partially employed. Well, we assume that if you've got a job, you are employed. So it doesn't matter if it's a full-time job or a part-time job. You count as one, and your one goes into the pool of employed. So what's the labour force participation rate? If we go back to the bar here, labour force participation rate is just the percentage of the adult population that's in the labour force. So it's how many people are not homemakers, not decided to drop out of the labour force, not, how many people aren't in that situation. So it's percentage of the total adult population in the labour force. So how do we calculate it? Well, it's the labour force divided by the adult population, working age times 100. And here on those bar charts, you can see we could calculate those things. The labour force in this country is about 2/3 of the adult working age population. Also, the nice thing about being in the US is in the US you can ask people about their race. By the way, in European countries you can't. If in France you ask someone, are they black or white or North African, you can be arrested. That is illegal. So, and in most of Europe it is, in fact. So it's considered discrimination, and they don't even allow it on surveys. In the US they do allow it. So, for example, here's a split down between white males and white females, and we can determine whether their unemployment rate and their labour force participation rate. As you'd expect, highest percentage labour force participation rate is white males, and the lowest is white females, interestingly. Within the black population, the black male participation rate is highest amongst males, lowest amongst females. The unemployment rate, though, the opposite way round. It's highest amongst males, black males, and lowest among black females. Same thing goes for whites. Excuse me. When we look at teenagers, unemployment rates are way higher. So for white males, 25.2. For black males, it's 46%. That's incredibly high by any measure. This was for 2009. So 2009 we were in a recession. So these are high levels. But to be honest, the teenage unemployment rates are often a big cause for concern. So women ages 20 and older have lower rates of labour force participation than men. Why is that? Well, partially that women, take time out to have children, obviously. Also, in terms of being homemakers, it's more likely that the woman still is the homemaker, although there are many instances now of men being homemakers. Once in the labour force, though, men and women have similar rates of unemployment. So when we look at older groups, those 50 and over, you find that the unemployment rates are roughly equal between men and women. Obviously, we talked about blacks and we talked about teenagers there. There's just some facts written out about those. Here's the unemployment rate. Now, we also in economics have this term called the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is the average rate of unemployment, usually over the past 20 years. Why do we do this? Well, we want to try and find some kind of benchmark, to where unemployment should go back to. Now, obviously, if there's an upward trend in unemployment over a 20-year period, that's going to figure in the natural rate. In other words, the average is going up. Usually that means there's some kind of problem with the economy, what economists often call a structural problem. The structure of the economy is not right in terms of hiring more people. There's something not going on there that is good. You can see the spike in unemployment rate as we went into 2010. As I said, it's still around 9.1, so it's way above the natural rate of unemployment. And the average could be considered the normal rate, if you like, of unemployment. If it's the average, then of course the unemployment rate should fluctuate around it, hopefully. There's another term that economists have, that's cyclical unemployment. Because the economy goes into booms and busts, it has what we call a business cycle. Then in the upswings in the economy, we'd expect to see unemployment fall. The downswings, where the economy goes into recession, we'd expect to see the unemployment rate rise. So as a case study, labor force participation of men and women in the US economy. The women's role in American society has changed dramatically over the past century. So why? Because over the past 50 years, there are new technologies which has reduced the amount of time required to complete routine household tasks, which women were usually expected to do. Improved birth control, so women can plan their lives much better, which has reduced the number of children born into a typical family. And changing social and political attitudes as well towards women in the workforce, and also towards men being homemakers, etc. So here we see over time, and we're looking back the last 50, 60 years, the participation rate for men and for women. And you can see, and this is probably the biggest change in the labor force, in the composition of the labor force anyway. You know, back in 1950, the labor force participation rate for women was around just over 30%. Now it's nearly 60%. So there's been a doubling in that labor force participation rate. At the same time, you can see that the labor force participation rate for men has fallen from around 85% to around 78%. And it's heading down towards 75%. So more men staying at home, deciding to do things other than work. In some cases, be the homemaker. So there you can see 33% men and 87% men, 33% women back in 1950. 59% women and 72% men. So why is the fall in men's labour force participation rate going on? Well, I've talked about more stay-at-home fathers, so that's the third kind of point there. But there's also, older men, so men retire earlier and live longer, and younger men, so men stay in school longer. By the way, all those staying in school or university go into the not in the labour force. If you're a full-time student, officially you are. If you don't have a job, you are not in the labour force. If you have a part-time job, even though you're a full-time student, you would go into the labour force and you would be counted as employed. So there you can see that at the bottom. Full-time students. Retirees, as I said, are out of the labour force, and stay-at-home dads would be also out of the labour force. So let's talk about the official unemployment rate. Well, it's useful, and I tell you what, the stock market really focuses on that unemployment rate sometimes. Recently it has been doing, because they've wanted to gauge whether the unemployment situation in the US is getting worse or better. Unfortunately, it's a pretty imperfect measure of joblessness. Part of the reason for that is that there's movements into and out of the labour force, and this is common. So you're never quite sure if the unemployment rate goes down, whether it's because actually less people, or there's more jobs out there, or whether, because remember how it's calculated as a percentage of the labour force, or whether a bunch of people have decided we just can't get a job and we're just going to not even bother looking. If they don't bother to look, as I told you earlier, they're not classified as unemployed. Therefore, they're not in the labor force. So that's one of the problems with this. This is an imperfect measure. So not all unemployment ends up with a job. Seeker finding a job. Only half of all spells of unemployment is that the case. And it may be that the unemployed person leaves the labor force. And why is that? Well, maybe the person isn't trying hard to find a job. Maybe they want to stay in the labor force for a period of time because then they qualify for government help. Maybe they are working, but they're paid under the table. All of those instances, that person might be reported as unemployed, or will be reported as unemployed if they didn't declare that work in particular. Now, we've also got the possibility, if some of the people who are claiming to be unemployed are working under the table, that we might have some people who are not in the labor force who would actually like to take a job. They're just too depressed about the situation, in terms of finding a job. Those in economics we call discouraged workers. They would like to work, but they've given up looking for a job. In a way, they're still unemployed, and we don't include them in the statistics. However, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has now come out with a different measure of unemployment that does include those people. And if you include those people, the current level of unemployment is in the teens. I think it's up to 18% unemployment. And here are these alternative measures. As you can see, the U6 is the highest measure, and that's total unemployed plus all the marginally attached workers plus total employed part-time for economic reasons as a percent of the civilian labor force plus all marginally attached workers. So again, it's a percentage, and that nearly comes to 18. It did during the recession. So marginally attached workers are persons who currently are neither working nor looking for work, but indicate that they want and are available for a job and have looked for work some time in the recent past. Discouraged workers are rather similar as well. Right. Well, I would put marginally attached and discouraged pretty much together. And the persons available there employed part-time, persons employed part-time for economic reasons, and they're available for full-time work, but they've settled for part-time work. They are partially employed, if you like, and as I said, they're counted within the labor force. But if you count them as partly unemployed, then that changes the statistics, of course, and that's what they do above. So next question, if you're unemployed, how long are you unemployed for? Well, in fact, most spells of unemployment are pretty short, around 3 months, in normal times. We're not in normal times right now, unfortunately. Most unemployment observed at any given time is going to be long-term. That's because when you look at this like a pool of workers, the short-term unemployed are the people who usually come into the pool of unemployed and leave as soon as they can. They get a job. So the ones that are left in the pool who can't seem to get a job, they're called long-term unemployed. And they're the big concern, by the way. The more long-term unemployed you have, the more of a problem you have in society, because these people, don't have a job and apparently don't have any prospect of a job. So, the unemployment problem, as I said, is mostly attributable to the relatively few workers who are jobless for long periods of time. So if anyone says to you, we need to get the unemployment rate down to 0, tell them they haven't done an economics course, because of course you can never get the unemployment rate down to 0. There will always be people leaving their current job for another job and then who decide to declare themselves unemployed. So the unemployment rate was going to fluctuate around this natural rate. Now there are other types of unemployment as well that we can kind of classify unemployment into. So the first is frictional unemployment, and that is those people who are leaving their jobs either because they've been laid off or because they've quit on their own free will, and they're looking for another job that better suits their tastes and skills. And that's what most of the unemployed are. So they don't stay unemployed usually for very long. The second category of unemployment is what we call structural unemployment. I hinted at it before, but this is when people become unemployed because of the structure of the economy changing over time. And usually those people get thrown out of jobs because their industry is in decline. They try and find another job somewhere and they can't. So steel workers, if they were laid off, or coal miners, if they were laid off, are good examples of that. Or even car workers recently, auto workers. So they are usually the longer term unemployed. And also they tend to be longer term unemployed as well if they've had really good jobs in the past, like those working for GM and the Detroit car auto manufacturers. They were paid very well, so it's going to be almost impossible for them to find a job that has such good wages and benefits. So they're likely to be unemployed for a period of time. So what do people do when they're looking for a job? Well, they do what we call a job search. They find the most appropriate jobs given their tastes and skills. And of course, we're all different, so each worker has different tastes and different skills, and they have to try and find a match. Try and find an employer that wants them, so where they feel comfortable. So that's a slow process in terms of matching the people, and takes some time. So in this case, if it takes some time, obviously you know that frictional unemployment is never going to be zero. There's always going to be some friction going on, people changing jobs. If the economy is a dynamic economy, and most economies are, then the structure of the economy is going to be changing over time. So there's also going to be structural unemployment over time. So that's really what this slide says. How can we reduce the rate of unemployment, particularly now because it's so high? Well, one policy that we can do is to try and reduce the time it takes for the unemployed to find jobs. And if that's the case, if we have a long-lasting effect on the unemployment rate, then inevitably over time, over a longer period of time, we would reduce the natural rate of unemployment. So trying to find ways of doing that are often at the heart of government policy. And government programs exist to facilitate that kind of job search. Indeed, I think the West German program is now being talked about a lot on TV and radio. I've heard different segments in news programs talking about German unemployment. What they do there is they had such a large pool of unemployed that they got the government, to pay firms to employ people on a subsidized wage for a period of time. And often the firms liked what they saw, they liked the workers, and they decided to hire them full-time. So in that case, the government program has helped to reduce unemployment because it's reducing presumably the natural rate of unemployment over time. There's also training programs that are good, particularly with those who are structurally unemployed, so those who are who are unemployed because of the changing structure of the economy. In other words, we don't make as many automobiles as we used to, and even when we do come to the same level of output of automobiles, we're probably going to be more efficient, so we'll need less people per automobile. So that means inevitably some people will lose their jobs permanently. If we can put into place public sector training programs or public training programs, then some of those people thrown out of work can be trained or retrained to do something else. It's also unemployment insurance, which is a government program. It partially protects workers' incomes when they become unemployed. What also will it do? Well, the fact that you get an income when you're unemployed is going to obviously delay you going back into the labor force maybe. On the other hand, if there is a delay in you going back into the labor force, not into the labor force, but getting a job, I should say, then in many ways that might be a good thing because you can better match the job to your skills. So we know that it increases frictional unemployment, obviously without intending to do so. It's an unintended consequence there. To qualify, only the unemployed who were laid off because their previous employers no longer needed their skills, they're the only ones that qualify. So if you quit your job, you're not eligible, I don't think, for unemployment insurance. You have to be laid off. What do you get on unemployment insurance? You get 50% of the former wages for 26 weeks. It reduces the hardship of unemployment and it increases the number of people unemployed. And those unemployment benefits stop when a worker takes a new job. What's the effect on the unemployed? It does mean that they're going to devote less effort to job search because they've got some kind of insurance, some kind of a security. And they're going to likely turn down unattractive job offers and less likely to seek guarantees of job security. On the other hand, it does mean that when they do eventually get a match, a good job, that the match is going to be probably better. With structural unemployment, the number of jobs out there is usually insufficient, and often you need the workers to be retrained. Minimum wage laws can also cause unemployment. We've seen this already in the course because it causes the wage to remain above the equilibrium. We've seen this already with minimum wage, but let's go through it again. This is the labour market. There's the minimum wage. It's set at above the equilibrium in the labour market. It causes unemployment. As I said though earlier, the minimum wage in this country is set pretty much below the wage that most workers get, except for those who are low-skilled workers and teenage workers. Now, there's this idea of efficiency wages. So there are three reasons why these wages may be kept above equilibrium. We've already talked about the minimum wage. Also, unions can often push the wage up above the minimum wage. They did that, for instance, with the Detroit auto workers. They were very heavily unionized. That meant that they got lots of benefits, but on the other hand, there were less of them employed. So that's another reason, unions. Although we don't really have strong unions in this country, so more likely it's this efficiency wages argument. Efficiency wages means wages that are higher than the equilibrium because the company wants to try and get the best workers, more efficient workers, in other words. So that's called efficiency wages in economics. For whatever reason, if the wage is kept above the equilibrium level, then the result is going to be unemployment. So here we have unions. As you know, it's a worker association. Usually the unions bargain directly with the employer over the wages, benefits and working conditions. It only covers 12% of US workers, and that's been falling. I believe it's now closer to 10%. It's a type of what we call a cartel. A cartel is where firms get together, or in this case, unions get together instead of having individual workers bargaining for their wages, and the unions bargain for them. And the process in which unions negotiate their conditions under which their workers, their members, are employed is called collective bargaining. And if the negotiations don't go well, often the union, will strike. That means they will withdraw their labor from a firm, and that's going to reduce production, sales, and profit. On average, union workers tend to earn about 10 to 20% more than workers who are non-unionized. What does that mean? Well, it means there's obviously going to be a high quantity of labor supplied in that industry, but a smaller quantity of labor demanded, and you will get unemployment. Who's better off in this situation? Well, the people who are in the union, they're better off, the so-called insiders. They're employed. The people who are worse off, of course, are the unemployed, the people who are often called the outsiders. They may stay unemployed, or they might take jobs in firms that are not unionized. So what happens here? Well, you get the supply of labor increasing in industries that are not unionized, which leads to an even lower wage because their labor supply curve shifts to the right. So the workers in unions really benefit in a way at the expense of the workers that are not in the unions. They do bear some of the cost. So, are unions good or bad for the economy? Well, unions are a type of cartel. They're a type of price fixer. They allocate labor inefficiently because that reduces employment below the efficient level, and they're inequitable. In other words, some workers really benefit, but it's partially at the expense of those other workers. However, not everyone thinks that unions are a bad thing. And why is that? Well, some people say that unions are necessary as an antidote to the market power of the firms that hire workers. In the absence of a union, firms would pay lower wages and offer worse working conditions. I think certainly in 19th century Britain, the start of unionization in the 1800s, when we had the Industrial Revolution in northern part of England, the advent of the unions caused a dramatic change in the working conditions of the workers there. And I think the unions in those instances, can often do a lot of good, but not always. So unions can also help firms respond efficiently to workers' concerns. It's a good way of having a direct input into decision making within the firm, to have just one person to deal with rather than to have to ask all the workers. And the people who are lower down the ladder in many organizations are frightened to speak up because they're worried that what they say might not meet the approval of their bosses and they'll be let go. So unions can often fulfill that role. Talked about efficiency wages already. Often firms offer above equilibrium wages to good workers, where they think they're going to get more than a regular worker would give, and that often is the case if they can find healthy workers. If they can find workers that are committed to a job, it'll reduce their turnover, and that means reduce all their training costs. If they get quality workers, then they want to pay them more to keep them. And if they have employees that really make an effort and work overtime and stay late and all the rest of it, then they might pay them efficiency wages. The companies that do pay efficiency wages right now, definitely Google, and they don't really necessarily employ Americans at their headquarters, which of course is in America. They want to recruit the best in the world, and they pay well, and they give you free meals at lunch, and they have a free, I believe, dry cleaning service, free daycare, free car washing even. So those things are laid on to get what they consider the best tech workers out there. So what's the theory here? Here you can see this kind of broken down. Worker health, better paid workers eat a more nutritious diet. They can afford the broccoli. They can afford the things that are good for you. And healthier workers are more productive workers. It reduces the turnover. The post office is another example of good wages for relatively unskilled labor. But the post office famously has very low turnover, principally because for the type of work that you have to do at the post office, it's very good wages. The firm pays a high wage. It usually attracts a better pool of workers and increases the quality of the workforce. And the high wages make workers more eager to keep their jobs because they're paid high wages. and that gives them an incentive to put forward their best effort. This is probably the best historical example, Henry Ford and the very generous $5 a day wage. Henry Ford was, of course, the founder of Ford Motor Company. He introduced modern techniques of production, built cars on assembly lines, and the output was the Model T Ford. And in 1914, Ford gave his workers a $5 workday. It was twice the going wage, which was $2.50 a day then. There were long lines of people wanting jobs with Ford, way more than the number of workers Ford needed. What that meant is that, of course, he could pick the best workers, and he'd expect a lot out of them. And, of course, they were eager to offer a lot because they wanted to keep those jobs. So turnover of staff fell, absenteeism fell, productivity rose, workers became much more efficient. And Ford's production costs were still lower than their competitors despite these higher wages. So efficiency wages are where the firm decides to pay higher wages to get the better workers. And this was closely linked to Ford's use of the assembly line. Assembly line is highly interdependent workers. So interdependent means they depend on each other. So down the assembly line, they had to communicate well. They had to be a good set of workers. You couldn't have one bad apple. And that's the end of this recording. Thanks for listening.